They say first impressions are everything, but on this flight, assumptions nearly cost more than a comfortable seat. I'm Dr. Nathaniel Harris, a surgeon accustomed to saving lives, not defending my place in the world. When a fellow passenger's biases collide with a mid-flight emergency, the tension soars. What unfolds isn't just a lesson in humanity, it's a reminder of the quiet power of grace under pressure. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The airport buzzed with the frenetic energy of hurried passengers and crackling announcements. As I walked through the terminal, I felt the familiar tug of weariness from countless trips just like this one. The life of a surgeon left little room for stillness, but I'd come to accept that. The early mornings, the late nights, and the constant travel were all part of the deal, a deal I'd struck with myself years ago, trading comfort for the privilege of saving lives. I reached my gate and paused, letting my gaze drift across the room. Families corralled their children, businesspeople tapped on laptops, and travelers with tired eyes lined up for overpriced coffee. These were the little rituals of travel that felt oddly grounding. My first-class ticket, earned through years of relentless effort, rested in my pocket. A small token of success that carried its own weight. My fingers brushed the ticket as I stepped into the priority boarding line. The gleaming first-class cabin greeted me as I boarded, its plush seats promising a brief reprieve from the grind. I couldn't help but appreciate the comfort, though I knew all too well that such spaces often came with unspoken challenges. As I stowed my carry-on and settled into my seat, my attention was drawn to a woman entering the cabin. She was impeccably dressed, her designer coat flowing behind her as she walked. The sharp click of her heels against the floor seemed almost intentional, as if announcing her arrival. She glanced at her boarding pass and then at me. Her expression flickered, just for a moment, into something unmistakably disapproving. I met her eyes with the calm composure I'd cultivated over the years. She was already turning toward the flight attendant, her voice sharp as she spoke. "Excuse me, there must be a mistake. I'm supposed to be in first class," she said, her tone dripping with entitlement. The flight attendant smiled politely, her professionalism unwavering. "Yes, ma'am. This is your seat." The woman, Victoria Reed, I later learned, shifted her weight and cast another glance my way. "Are there no other seats available?" she asked, her voice tinged with condescension. I stayed silent, my focus on the tablet I'd placed on the tray table in front of me. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered someone like her, and it wouldn't be the last. Experience had taught me that engaging in such moments rarely yielded anything productive. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant said. "The flight is full." Victoria exhaled sharply, as though inconvenienced by the universe itself. "Fine," she muttered, sliding into the seat beside me. The air between us felt charged, heavy with tension. I adjusted my seatbelt and returned to my tablet, opening my notes for the upcoming conference. Behind the facade of calm, my thoughts churned. Encounters like this were reminders of the unspoken rules that still governed so many spaces. My presence here, despite all I'd achieved, was still seen as an anomaly by people like Victoria. The pre-flight announcements began, offering a brief distraction. I leaned back, closing my eyes as the cabin prepared for takeoff. I could feel Victoria shifting uncomfortably beside me, her irritation practically radiating off her. As the plane accelerated down the runway, I focused on the hum of the engines. I was no stranger to turbulence, both in the air and in life. Whatever awaited me on this flight, I was determined to face it with the same resolve that had carried me through everything else. The plane leveled off, and a faint ding signaled the flight attendant's freedom to move about the cabin. I glanced out the window, the blanket of clouds below offering a temporary illusion of peace. I welcomed the distraction, knowing all too well that it wouldn't last. Beside me, Victoria shifted again. I could feel her eyes on me. The weight of her scrutiny as tangible as the armrest between us. I kept my focus on my tablet, scrolling through the presentation slides for the conference. The data was straightforward. The kind of thing I could recite in my sleep, but tonight it served a second purpose, a shield. "Excuse me," she said abruptly, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp. The kind that demanded attention without ever earning it. I turned slightly, meeting her gaze with an expression I hoped conveyed patience. "Yes?" I replied evenly. She tilted her head. Her eyes scanning me in a way that felt uncomfortably personal. "Are you, some sort of entertainer?" she asked, her tone oozing with condescension. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "No," I said simply, waiting to see where this line of questioning was going. Her brow furrowed slightly, as though the idea of a different answer hadn't occurred to her. "Oh. Then you must be, what? A sports agent? Or a motivational speaker?" I could feel the words she wasn't saying, the assumptions she was making without knowing anything about me. Keeping my voice steady, I answered. "Actually, I'm a surgeon." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment, I thought she might let the conversation end there. But instead, she doubled down. Her tone tinged with skepticism. "Really? A surgeon?" she repeated, as though testing the word. "What kind of surgeon?" "A cardiothoracic surgeon," I said. Adding just enough emphasis to remind her that my expertise was not up for debate. The briefest pause hung between us before she leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "Well, good for you," she muttered, her tone dripping with false magnanimity. I returned to my notes, determined to let the matter rest, but her words lingered like an echo. I'd spent my entire career proving myself. Earning every accolade, every opportunity, only to find that for some people, none of it would ever be enough. The flight attendant passed by with a tray of drinks, and Victoria leaned forward. Her voice rising slightly as she ordered champagne. She made a point of mentioning it twice, ensuring everyone within earshot knew she wasn't settling for anything less than perfection. When the flight attendant handed her the glass, Victoria lifted it delicately, her manicured fingers glinting against the rim. "Cheers," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Before taking a sip, I turned back to my tablet, determined to focus. But just as the peace I'd been seeking began to settle, the intercom crackled. And the flight attendant's voice broke through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency. If there is a doctor on board, please press your call button immediately." The words snapped me into action before I'd even processed them. My training kicked in, automatic and unrelenting. Without hesitation, I pressed the call button and stood. My hand already reaching for my bag. "I'm a doctor," I said firmly to the flight attendant who rushed toward me, her eyes wide with relief. "What's the situation?" The aisle narrowed as I followed the flight attendant toward the back of the plane. Passengers craned their necks, whispering among themselves as I passed. The cabin felt heavier with every step. The kind of silence that accompanies fear and uncertainty. We reached the source of the commotion, a middle-aged man slumped in his seat, his face pale and slick with sweat. A small crowd had gathered. Their concern etched in every expression. "Please, give me some space," I said, my voice calm but firm. Years of working in high-pressure environments had taught me the importance of projecting confidence, even when adrenaline was coursing through my veins. The flight attendant knelt beside me, clutching a medical kit. "He collapsed during the drink service," she said quickly. "We haven't been able to get a response." I nodded, already assessing the man's condition. His breathing was shallow, and his pulse was weak, a dangerous combination. Time was not on our side. "Can someone grab the AED?" I asked, my tone urgent but steady. The flight attendant hurried off. And I turned back to the passenger. "Sir, can you hear me?" I asked, gently tapping his shoulder. No response. The moment stretched thin as I worked, my hands moving with practiced precision. I tilted his head back to open his airway, checking for signs of obstruction. My training kicked in like muscle memory, each step rooted in years of experience. The flight attendant returned with the AED, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to me. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," I replied, wasting no time. I applied the pads to the man's chest, the cool adhesive pressing against his clammy skin. The machine beeped as it analyzed his heart rhythm, its robotic voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Shock advised," it announced. The tension in the air was palpable as I pressed the button. The man's chest jolted, his body momentarily lifting off the seat. All eyes were on him. The collective hope of the cabin resting on a single heartbeat. I leaned in, checking his pulse. Relief washed over me as I felt a faint but steady rhythm beneath my fingertips. His breathing, though labored, began to stabilize. "He's coming back," I said, my voice louder this time, meant to reassure both the flight crew and the gathered passengers. A ripple of murmured relief spread through the crowd. The flight attendant crouched beside me again, her face alight with gratitude. "What now?" she asked. "We'll need to monitor him closely until we land," I said. "And alert emergency services to meet us at the gate." She nodded, hurrying off to make the necessary arrangements. I turned back to the man, watching as color slowly returned to his cheeks. He blinked weakly, his eyes fluttering open. "You're going to be okay," I said softly. "Just try to stay still." The applause began tentatively, like rain pattering on a tin roof, before swelling into something more. It caught me off guard. I wasn't doing this for recognition, but for the simple reason that it was my responsibility. Still, I nodded politely to the onlookers as I gathered my things and returned to my seat. The walk back felt longer than the walk to the scene. The cabin was alive with murmurs, every face turned toward me as I passed. In the quiet hum of admiration, I caught sight of Victoria. Her expression was different now, less rigid, less certain. For the first time since we'd boarded, she looked at me as though she truly saw me. I sat down, my heart still pounding from the adrenaline. I glanced at Victoria, who opened her mouth as if to speak but then closed it again. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she turned back to her champagne. For once, she didn't take a sip. The cabin had returned to a semblance of calm, but the air felt different now. Conversations were hushed, as though everyone was still processing what had just unfolded. I leaned back in my seat, letting out a slow breath. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. Victoria sat stiffly beside me, her hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't said a word since I returned, though I could feel her stealing glances in my direction. I turned my attention back to my tablet, hoping to regain focus. But her voice interrupted the silence. "I didn't know you were a doctor," she said, her words tentative and softer than I'd expected. I glanced at her, meeting her gaze for the first time since the emergency. Her expression was unguarded now, lacking the sharp edges it had carried earlier. "You didn't ask," I replied evenly, keeping my tone neutral. She winced slightly, the subtle jab landing as intended. There was a long pause, the kind that stretched uncomfortably, before she spoke again. "I mean, I assumed," well, she trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I made some assumptions about you, and I." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. It was a vulnerable gesture, one that caught me off guard. "I was wrong," she said finally, the words barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I studied her for a moment, weighing her sincerity. Apologies like these were not unfamiliar to me, half-formed admissions that skirted around deeper truths. But there was something different about this one, something that felt raw. I understand, I said quietly, though the reality was more complicated than that. Understanding didn't erase the sting of moments like these, but it did help me find a measure of peace. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on her lap. I don't know what I was thinking, she murmured, almost to herself. I've been so wrapped up in my own world. I didn't even stop to consider. Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. I could see the weight of the moment settling on her. The dawning realization of how her actions had affected others, not just me, but everyone she'd encountered with similar judgments. It's not easy, I said gently. But recognizing it is the first step. Her eyes lifted to mine, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. For a moment, I wondered if she'd expected me to lash out, to meet her vulnerability with anger. Instead, I offered her a small nod, hoping it would be enough to show that I wasn't her enemy. The flight attendant approached, offering another round of drinks. Victoria declined, her champagne untouched. I asked for water, needing something to ground me after the whirlwind of the past hour. As the attendant walked away, Victoria turned toward me again. "What you did back there," she said softly, her voice steadier now. "You saved that man's life. I don't even know how to thank someone for that." I gave her a faint smile. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "It's my job." She nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "It's more than that, though," she murmured. "It's who you are." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. For the first time, I saw something shift in her, an awareness that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of self-reflection that hinted at change. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Victoria stayed quiet, lost in her thoughts, while I returned to my notes. But every now and then, I caught her looking at me. Her expression no longer one of judgment but of something closer to respect. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the descent into Los Angeles. The familiar pressure shift tugged at my ears as I packed away my tablet, ready to step back into the rush of life. Yet, as the plane began its gradual descent, I couldn't shake the weight of the interaction that had unfolded. Victoria sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. She'd been silent for most of the flight, her earlier bravado replaced by a contemplative stillness. The champagne she demanded with such entitlement remained untouched on her tray, a testament to how much had shifted in just a few hours. I reached up to retrieve my carry-on as the flight attendants moved through the cabin with final instructions. Beside me, Victoria hesitated, her body language stiff with indecision. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice softer than I'd heard it before. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I turned to face her, studying her expression. The sharp lines of judgment that had defined her earlier seemed to have softened, replaced by something closer to humility. "For what I said," she continued, her voice wavering slightly. "For how I acted. It wasn't fair. Or right." I nodded, acknowledging her words without rushing to absolve her. "Apologies are a good start," I said evenly. "But it's what you do next that matters." She blinked, the subtle challenge in my tone catching her off guard. For a moment, I wondered if she'd bristle, retreat into defensiveness. But instead, she nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "You're right," she said. "I have a lot to think about." The plane touched down with a jolt, the sudden movement breaking the moment between us. As the cabin filled with the sounds of seatbelts unclicking and passengers gathering their belongings, Victoria reached for her bag. She moved with a deliberateness that felt uncharacteristic. Her usual briskness tempered by reflection. As we stood to leave, she glanced at me one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, offering her a small, polite smile. "Take care, Ms. Reed." The walk through the terminal was a blur of motion and sound. The flight felt like a distant memory already, yet the emotions it had stirred lingered with me. I thought of the man whose life I'd saved, of the applause that had followed. But most of all, I thought of Victoria Reed and the ripple effect of moments like these. I'd learned long ago not to measure the impact of my actions by immediate results. True change, I knew, was often invisible at first, subtle shifts in perspective that only revealed themselves with time. And yet, there was something about the look in Victoria's eyes as she'd apologized that gave me hope. Perhaps, I thought, this moment would stay with her, shaping the choices she made long after the flight had ended. As I stepped into the bright Los Angeles sunshine, I allowed myself a rare moment of optimism. The world, for all its flaws, was still capable of change. And if this flight had taught me anything, it was that even the smallest acts of grace could leave a lasting mark. The next few weeks passed in a blur of surgeries, patient consultations, and late nights spent at the hospital. Life had a way of pulling me back into its relentless rhythm, but every now and then, my thoughts drifted back to the flight and the unexpected exchange with Victoria Reed. It wasn't just her apology that lingered, it was the possibility that it might actually lead to something meaningful. Over the years, I'd learned to temper my expectations when it came to moments like these. People often meant well, but true change was rare and required more than good intentions. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if the seeds planted during that flight would take root. One evening, as I reviewed patient charts in my office, notification pinged on my phone. It was an email from the foundation I'd established years ago, a charity providing cardiac care to underserved communities. Curious, I opened it. The message was simple. A substantial donation had been made in my name, accompanied by an anonymous note. The words, though brief, struck a chord. "Thank you for opening my eyes. I hope this helps make a difference." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The anonymity didn't fool me. I knew exactly who had sent it. A faint smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Not from pride but from a quiet sense of validation. It wasn't about the money, it was about what it represented, a first step toward accountability and action. The following month, the charity hosted its annual gala, an event I'd come to both dread and cherish. It was a chance to celebrate the progress we'd made while raising awareness and funds. But it also meant stepping into the spotlight, something I'd never been entirely comfortable with. As I mingled with donors and colleagues, my eyes caught sight of a familiar figure across the room. Victoria Reed stood near the entrance, her posture more subdued than I remembered. She wasn't dressed to impress this time, her outfit was elegant but understated. A far cry from the commanding presence she'd exuded on the plane. She didn't approach me, and I didn't go to her. Instead, I watched as she moved quietly through the room, speaking to a few people but mostly observing. It was clear she hadn't come to be seen or acknowledged, she was here for a different reason. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, I noticed her standing by the gallery of photographs showcasing the foundation's work. Images of smiling children post-surgery, families reunited with their loved ones, and doctors in remote clinics lined the walls. She lingered on one photo in particular, a young boy holding a stethoscope, his face lit with the kind of joy that only comes from newfound hope. I approached her, stopping a few feet away. She turned, startled at first, but then her expression softened. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly. "You're not," I replied, my voice calm. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, her gaze shifting back to the photo. I wanted to see for myself, she said softly. What you're doing, it's incredible. It's a team effort, I said, gesturing to the bustling room. None of this happens without support. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw no trace of the person I'd met on that plane. There was no entitlement. No defensiveness, only sincerity. I've been trying to do better, she admitted. Reading, learning, volunteering. It's not enough, I know, but it's a start. I nodded, offering her a small smile. That's all anyone can do. As I left the gala that night, I felt a sense of closure. The flight, the emergency, the awkward apology, it had all led to this. It was a reminder that change, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways we might never fully see. Looking up at the night sky, I allowed myself a rare moment of peace. Life would continue to challenge me, to test my resolve, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. They reminded me why I'd chosen this path, to not just heal hearts, but to open them as well.